So, in 1917, a pretty small group of revolutionaries managed to topple an entire empire. You think that's the end of the story, right? Nope. The real fight for Russia was just getting started. It turns out seizing power was the easy part. Holding on to it, with enemies coming from every direction, well, that was going to take a level of ruthlessness and pragmatism that would ultimately forge the Soviet Union.
Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk through 5 key crises that the Bolsheviks faced. Each one of these was a make or break moment that shaped their path from a shaky victory to an iron-fisted state. Every challenge forced a decision that hardened their rule and defined their future. All right, first up, their first big test wasn't on a battlefield, it was actually at the ballot box. And for the Bolsheviks, it was a total political disaster that forced them to make a really brutal choice, one that basically set the stage for everything that came after. And this quote from Lenin, it says it all. He said this right after the results came in for Russia's first ever truly democratic election for something called the Constituent Assembly. And the results? They were a disaster for the Bolsheviks. They only pulled in about 24% of the vote. The Social Revolutionaries, or SRs, who were huge with the peasants, they cleaned up with 53%. For a party that claimed to represent the will of the people, this was a massive public rejection. So what does Lenin do? Does he form a coalition? Nope. After just one day, he sends in soldiers and shuts the whole thing down, at gunpoint. This was such a pivotal moment. Lenin basically argued that the Soviets, the workers' councils, were a more advanced form of democracy anyway. This complete refusal to share power was the first major step towards creating a one-party state. There weren't going to be any compromises. Okay, so they've dealt with their political rivals. Now for crisis number 2, this disastrous ongoing war with Germany that was just bleeding the country dry. Remember, Lenin's big promise was peace, land, and bread. And now he had to deliver on the peace part, no matter how steep the price. At first, Trotsky, their top diplomat, tried this kind of clever but ultimately failed tactic of neither peace nor war. It didn't work. The Germans just started advancing again. With the Russian army completely falling apart, the Bolsheviks had their backs against the wall. They were forced to sign what even Lenin admitted was a humiliating robber peace. And the cost of this peace? It was staggering. We're talking about losing huge, resource-rich territories that were vital for survival, like the entire breadbasket of Ukraine. The decision was so unpopular it actually caused a huge split inside the Bolshevik party itself. Guys like Bukharin were furious, demanding they fight a revolutionary war. But for Lenin, survival was everything. This was a painful but necessary gamble to buy the revolution a little breathing room. But getting out of the war with Germany just opened the door for a much bigger, much bloodier war at home. A brutal civil war exploded across the country, pitting Lenin's Red Army against a whole collection of anti-Bolshevik forces, who we know as the Whites. Just look at this timeline. It really shows you how insane this period was. One crisis just piles right on top of another. In just a handful of years, they're dealing with a world war, a civil war that spans the entire country, major rebellions, and being totally isolated by the rest of the world. It was just non-stop crisis mode. So why did the Reds win? This chart lays it out perfectly. On one side, you have the Bolsheviks. They had a single, clear ideology, Trotsky's brilliant leadership, and they controlled the industrial heartland of Russia. And the Whites? They were a total mess, a fractured alliance of everyone from monarchists to liberals, led by different generals who couldn't stand each other. They had no single vision to offer people, especially the peasants, who in the end kind of saw the Bolsheviks as the lesser of two evils. And check this out. 65,000 miles. That is how far Leon Trotsky traveled during the war on his personal armored train. He was the absolute genius behind the Red Army, racing from front to front, giving these powerful speeches to boost morale, but also enforcing brutal discipline, we're talking summary executions, to whip this army into a winning fighting force, basically from scratch. So you'd think after winning a massive civil war, they could finally relax, right? Wrong. The next threat came from the most unexpected place imaginable, their own biggest supporters. The very policies that helped them win the war ended up pushing the sailors at the Kronstadt naval base and the peasants in Tambov into open revolt against them. This quote from Lenin is so revealing. He calls the uprising a flash which lit up reality. Why? Because these sailors, the Kronstadt sailors, they were the pride and glory of the 1917 revolution. They were the original heroes. When they rebelled, it was a massive shock.
It was the ultimate signal that the policy of war communism, seizing grain from peasants to feed the army, had pushed the entire country to the brink of total collapse and famine. So Lenin's response is, well, it's a complete 180. He brutally crushes the revolts, of course, but then he does something nobody expected. He scraps war communism and introduces the new economic policy, or NEP. This essentially brought back a limited form of capitalism. Peasants could sell their extra grain for profit, and small private businesses were allowed to operate. Now, how do you sell bringing back capitalism to a party of hardcore communists? You frame it like this: 1 step backwards, 2 steps forwards. That was Lenin's pitch. He argued it was just a temporary, tactical retreat. They had to take 1 step back into a market economy to build up their strength, so they could later take 2 giant leaps forward into true socialism. But you can imagine how this went down with the party faithful and the Civil War veterans. It felt like a total betrayal. This quote from Victor Serge really captures that feeling. For what did we fight? They had just spent years fighting and dying to get rid of capitalists, and now suddenly this new class of flashy traders called netmen were getting rich. It seemed like the ideals of the revolution were just slipping away. All right, so this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. How did they manage all this internal chaos and still create a stable state that could survive in a pretty hostile world? They had to lock down absolute political control at home while finding a place for themselves on the world stage. Basically, they locked everything down. Power wasn't spread out. It was all crammed into these tiny elite committees, like the Politburo, that made all the decisions. They unleashed a terrifying secret police, the Cheka, to crush any opposition. All other newspapers were shut down, and every other political party was outlawed and its members hunted down. The state became an instrument of total control. Now, what about threats from other countries? You always hear about the Allied intervention in the Civil War. But this chart, it really puts things into perspective. Compared to the millions who died in the war itself, the Allied military effort was actually pretty small. It wasn't well coordinated, and in the end, it had very little real impact on the outcome. The bigger threat was being an economic and diplomatic outcast. So what this all shows is that Lenin's foreign policy got really, really practical. The dream of a global revolution, that was put on the back burner. Instead, he was focused on survival. He signed a trade agreement with capitalist Britain, and then, with the Treaty of Rapallo, he made a pact with the other European pariah state, Germany, to get the economy going again. So, when you put it all together, how did the Bolsheviks pull it off? They survived because they were absolutely ruthless with their enemies, but they were also incredibly flexible with their own ideology when they had to be. They built a state machine designed for total control. They had secured the state, but you could argue it came at the cost of the very revolutionary freedoms so many people had fought for. And that leaves us with this big question, and it's a tough one. Was this brutal, chaotic, and often contradictory path to power a masterclass in political pragmatism, doing what was necessary to save the revolution from being wiped out? Or was it a profound betrayal of the socialist and democratic ideals it was supposedly all about in the first place?